Hello, everybody, and Happy New Year. Today, we are talking about agentic AI and how do we secure it. Okay, so in this episode, we're going to talk about what agentic AI actually is, right, and why it's different from what we've been using up until now, right, and most importantly, how do organizations actually begin to secure it, right? So the episode, it's less about hype and it's more so about reality. And the reality that I'm seeing with my customers, and I'm sure a lot of you are seeing with your own customers as well, is that a lot of organizations out there are in a pilot or sort of a POC stage when it comes to agentic AI. Okay, so the goal of today's episode is simple, and by the end of the video, right, we should all have a clear mental model in terms of how agentic AI behaves, right, reimagining it as a new form of identity, right, and also making sure that we have a security first as a foundation. Okay, and speaking of foundations, here's what we're going to cover. So first, I want to clearly separate traditional AI from agentic AI because I think there's a bit of confusion, right? When we're speaking to customers, right, the conversation starts here, right? And when we talk about identity, right, it's not user identity, but it's how does identity itself need to be reimagined, right? When AI can act independently or autonomously, right? As in the name agentic AI. And then we're going to ask the big question, are agents actually the future or is it just another trend, right? So we're going to look at data. We're actually going to talk about real customer scenarios and understand, is this actually going to be the next big thing? And finally, we'll bring it back to reality and talk about, what all of this means for us as security professionals, and the people who actually have to design and secure and explain these different systems to different people in the organization. Because remember, agentic AI, when we're looking at security, I know in previous episodes, Purview was the golden boy. We're now going to be looking at it as a form of identity, right? So Entra has to come to the conversation. So speaking of conversation, let's start with traditional AI, okay? Because I think that's what most organizations and that's what most people are familiar with today, right? So when we're looking at the slide here, the user sends a prompt, right? The AI then analyzes the input and predicts its response, and then it also generates an answer and then it stops. Okay, so there's no like independent action, right? There's no long-term goal. There's no memory beyond the interaction, right? So every request is it's sort of it's bounded, and then the system waits passively for the user to send the next prompt. Okay, so from a security perspective, right, this is very important because the blast radius or like the collateral, right? It's relatively limited, right? So the AI can say the wrong thing, right? Or it can expose the data, right? If the user pastes some customer data in and you don't have it secure in the background, but it's not going to go off and do things on its own, right? There's no inherent action beyond what the user is receiving from a response perspective. Okay. And that's really important because that's where agentic AI becomes a bit of a nightmare from a security perspective, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, let's compare it with agentic AI, right? So instead of giving the prompt, right, we're giving it an objective. Okay, it could be book my flights to Santiago, right? Or send an email to Peter in accounting, right? But the AI breaks that objective into a task, right? So it's going to plan its own steps, right? It will call, tools, APIs, different systems, and then it also monitors your progress. It can adapt and it can also correct itself. And that's something that we have to be very, very conscious of, right? And I'll say it again, it can correct itself, right? So it's self-autonomous, right? And it's crucial that we understand it doesn't stop when it replies, right? It stops when the objective is complete, right? Let me say it again. Agentic AI does not stop when it replies or when it responds back to your prompt. It will stop when its objective or the objective that you stated, when it thinks it's complete, right? And that's the fundamental shift, right? That's what we have to understand. We're no longer dealing with a reactive system, right? The way I like to see it is think of it as as like an actor, right, inside of an environment, right? So once it can act, it can also misact or misbehave. It can overreach. It can drift, and that's where governance comes into the conversation, right? And again, it's just reimagining that governance when we're looking at agentic AI. And I say an actor, right? Think of it as an individual, and hence think of it as a new form of identity. And I guess not to backtrack, right? But we're already aware, right, of the risks with traditional AI, right? So even without autonomy, right? Just to go over it again. So the risk is, I guess, the main elephant in the room is obviously your uncontrolled data leakage. Okay, so employees copying and pasting sensitive data into public AI tools with sort of no visibility and governance, and then that leads on to the shadow AI conversation, because we saw from the MIT report that 90% of users back in 2025, because we're in 2026 now, were using shadow AI, right? So tools being used outside IT oversight, right? That creates your data flows that are untracked and hence are not secure. And sort of the third, or I guess the one that's least talked about the most when it comes to risks with traditional AI is that it's a weak or it has a weak identity and access boundaries, right? Assuming we're looking outside of Copilot, right? So traditional AI tools, they don't really understand your organization's IBAC or not IBAC, RBAC or identity, least privilege when it comes to when your data leaves the tenant, stuff like that. So the key takeaway here is that your traditional AI will react, right? It creates a risk, but it doesn't actively expand on that risk, right? And that's the distinction that really matters when we move forward into the risks regarding agentic AI. So this is where things accelerate. Okay, so agentic AI, it relies on your tools, your plugins, your connectors, right? So if those are over permissioned, right, then the agent can access or modify basically a lot more than what was intended. Okay, so if you're giving the your agent an elevated, permission within your organization, that's where things can get a bit, hairy. So what I describe it is unchecked lateral movement, right? That's sort of a major risk that we can see with agents, right? So what I mean by that is an agent with one entry point, right? It can pivot across, right, into your SharePoint, your Teams, your email, and sort of third party systems if your boundaries are weak. Okay, so when it comes to drifting, you've got lateral movement, and then you've got your operational drift as well, right? So this is what I'm talking about when it comes to the autonomy, where agents can, replan, they can self-correct, right? So if there's no guardrails, then they can slowly move from your organizational intent, right? And technically, according to the agent, they're still completing their objective, right? And that's sort of the key takeaway from this slide when it comes to the risks with agentic AI, is that traditional AI reacts, agentic AI acts, right? And when something acts, right, at a speed that is, very, very impressive, right, the way the technology is progressing, the consequences of poor governance also, right, scale much faster. Okay, and that's something to really take away from this, is that the faster an AI agent acts, right, the faster there is for I guess a real acceleration of a data breach, or again, as we see, operational drift or any unchecked lateral movement as well, right? So those are the risks that we see with agentic AI, right? And that leads us on to the next slide, which we have to reimagine, right, agentic AI as a new form of identity. So really, guys, if you're going to take anything from this, YouTube video or presentation, right, this is the pivot point of the entire conversation, right? So again, if agents can act, like I said, think of an agent as an actor, they need an identity, right? So we have to recognize that agents, they're first class identities, right? So just like our users or applications, right, they need identities in your Entra ID. Hence, that means they need authentication, they need traceability, they need accountability, okay? And then that leads into our second least privilege. So that becomes a non-negotiable, right? That has to become a non-negotiable, right? Agents have to have like a purpose-bound, task specific access, right? So the idea is that it's short-lived, right? So that's where our PIM, our conditional access, and even scoping permissions, right? They're going to become critical here, right? And then third, obviously, continuous monitoring agents, like as they're an identity, they have to be integrated within our governance cycle. Okay, so we see tools like Purview, right, that are great for like our DSPM, which is for AI, which is now being combined into the DSPM, tool within Purview to monitor our agents, which is still in preview at the minute. So we have to see what Microsoft are going to do with that before they roll it out. But their actions need to be audited, right? They need to be validated, they have to be reviewed. So just like any other high risk identity. Okay, so it's not about stopping agents, right? It's about making them governable. Okay, and that's something that I really want to push, right? Is that when it comes to regulation and innovation, they go hand in hand, right? The more regulation you have, right, to a certain extent, the faster you can innovate, the faster you can scale, right? And that's what we need to reimagine security as an AI enabler, right? Sure, we are putting guardrails, but those guardrails are there so that we can use AI effectively and securely, right? And I guess when it comes to the closing note of the video, right, agentic, it's not a future problem, right? It's a design problem. Okay, that's what agentic is, right? It's a present design problem, right? So the organizations that treat agents like identities, they're going to scale very, very effectively, right? And the ones that treat them like features, well, you're going to learn the hard way. right? That's my opinion, right? And I like a nice quote that we can see here: in a world filled with thousands of AI agents, security is going to become the new HR, right? Jensen Huang said it, basically saying that the IT team are going to become the new HR team of organizations. Okay, so we're onboarding a new form of intelligence, and hence we have to rethink the present security designs that we have within our organizations. Okay, guys, so to wrap this up, okay, the biggest mistake that organizations and customers can make right now is treating, agentic AI as just another feature. Okay, so we have to understand, once AI can now plan, it can act, it can adapt on its own, it stops being a tool, right? It stops being a feature and it starts behaving like an actor. Okay, so feature to actor, hence feature to identity. Okay, so that means the security question is, it's no longer what data can AI see, it becomes what can this AI actually do, right? Under whose identity and for how long. Okay, so the good news is that it's not, like, this isn't uncharted territory, right? We already know how to secure, right, a lot of our identities, and we do it every day with our users, our applications, our service accounts, right? So agentic AI, it just simply forces people to apply those same principles earlier, right? So you have to do it more deliberately and with far less tolerance for over permissioning as well. Okay, so if you take one thing away from this episode, I would say autonomy without identity is risk, and autonomy with governance is leverage. Okay, so thanks for watching. All right, and I'll see you in the next episode, and happy new year.